Abigail, thank you very much for joining us today. I have the great pleasure to introduce Steve Katz, who is the known as the first CISO. Welcome, Steve. Thank you for joining. Much appreciated in this cold, very cold winter day.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a cold, windy day here. It was 17 degrees early when I took the dogs out, and with wind, I think we're about zero. So it's not fun.
Hey, so what I'd love to do is to kind of pick your brain a little bit about, first of all, kind of the history of, how you came into cybersecurity, how you started, and maybe kind of cover some of the fundamentals that you managed to, adopt through the years in terms of cybersecurity, especially for the enterprise. And then also maybe kind of jump into some recommendations for the people that want to get into the space right now. What can you provide as an insight? And then talk about some, current events, just basically talk shop kind of thing. So just to get started, maybe walk us through some of your career highlights, like, how you started. What was your
Getting started is kind of fun. Way back when I got out of the university, I had my first career with Citigroup, then it was First National City Bank. And part of the job was being part of an internal consulting group within Citi, and going to helping to develop their SDLC and their system quality assurance functions. And we started to require ID and password modules in COBOL and Fortran code, which was kind of unique for the time. But if you think, and IDs and passwords were just clear text tables stored in stored. So anytime we had to add or delete or change a user, we had to recompile. But it was some form of security. And then IBM came out with RACF, and we had Top Secret and ACF2, and which was really the first attempt at single sign-on and getting rid of the application level security. At that time, I was able to spell security. I was recruited into Morgan Guarantee to help start the cybersecurity group, and they were installing RACF. And one of the first things I did, which got everyone totally ticked off, the installation that was in place at Morgan when I got there was giving everybody access to everything. So even though there was RACF in place, universal access was set to all, so you really didn't have to do anything. So we changed that to universal access equals none, and got the entire corporation totally ticked off with me.
And it's amazing, Steve, because again, back in the day, access all was almost like trivial, right? That was the default, right? So there was no mindset of securing, resources in the enterprise, right?
It was the default in RACF. It was access equal none was the default in ACF2 and Top Secret.
Wow.
So and this Morgan Guarantee was a RACF shop, and access universal access was set to all. So the first thing I did was have it set to none, which didn't make wouldn't make friends for me.
And so you had to almost pave the way, to explain to other senior folks within the organization. I mean, Citigroup was a large organization, to what it means to be secure, and also I'm assuming that was in the forefront. Back in the day, was were they like highlight news, like how it is today, like every week there's a new incident of breach and so on. Back then, it wasn't really a thing, was it? I mean, it was mostly kind of things that happened behind the scenes.
There was nothing, and trying to sell the concept of nothing to an organization was not easy. But in fairly short order, there was a number of security requirements that started to come out, and one of the things that came out from the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Investment Group, required that companies buy a security product, and then shortly thereafter they mandated that not only do you have to buy it, you had to install it, but you now had to sell a concept that there was something there that needed protection. And the only fallback was it was required. So if you became one of compliance more than anything else, and it was sort of developing everything from ground zero because there wasn't anything. Our security group at Citi, as I mentioned, was First National City Bank was IDs and passwords and application code. When I moved over to Morgan to help them set up their program, they were also, again, a RACF shop made universal access equal to none. Also put together an executive security committee, which were what we now call the C-suite or the executive leadership team that was our data security group. And all policies and directions came out under the heading of the Executive Security Leadership Council. And that made it a bit easier because these were the business leaders, and if I remember right, the chairman of the Executive Security Council was, I believe, was either the CFO or the head of the audit or the general auditor, and it went back and forth.
And this is so interesting because you mentioned that now there was a kind of a compliance requirement to go ahead and maybe provide some security overlay, but I'm assuming there was no budget set aside, right? This is something that you had to come out with because companies weren't aware that they have to spend money on it. So how did you then convince the powers that be to start putting together budgets associated with cybersecurity specifically?
Couple of things. Well, first of all, sort of rewind back. Initially, there wasn't even an IT budget at Morgan Guaranty. And then there was a requirement for an IT budget, but it wasn't being tracked. And then there was a requirement to actually track the budget. And information security, and data security, was just linked into the IT. There really wasn't anything that was looked at separately. It wasn't until, I'm trying to remember which act it was, I think, Fiducia, Federal Deposit Information Insurance, the insurance group, Fiducia, that required data security group to be set up, and which we did. We had RACF installed, and then in a fairly short period of time, we were looking at the smaller processors, and so was the Data Generals and the IBM AS400s, and then the PCs came into the world, and the IT leader said, "Well, that's not going to be allowed to happen at Morgan," and that sort of wasted
So Steve, what was kind of your first? So that's from a technology perspective, but how did you go ahead and start like assembling a team when people were not really didn't have much of a background in that? So what was your first go-to?
The first go-to, and it's been consistent and still not quite as universally implemented as it should be, but we tried it back then, was that data security was a business risk management issue. Businesses had risk, technology and security didn't have risk. So we had to, get that point across. The first program was mainframe access, which we didn't quite have anything equivalent in the DECVAX world. We didn't have the exact equivalent in the AS400 world, but starting to come up to speed. PCs that came in, and what made the headlines at that point was there was now something called a PC virus, which people either believed or didn't believe, but it became a reality, and it was literally led to my first exposure to the board of directors.
So Steve, that's so cool. So when you were talking about viruses at the time, people were like, I'm sure, like, well, looking at you like googly eyes. What are you talking about, right? Because that back in the day, it wasn't. Now every toddler knows what a virus is, right? aside from the pandemic one, but there's, computer virus.
It was really a wild and crazy experience. It did make headlines in the newspapers and on the news channels. Dr. Peter Tippett came in to visit. He is the founder of one of the first antivirus products on the market. He called and asked if he could come in and demonstrate the product. We found a bunch of viruses really on the PCs in my area. They were pretty innocuous. Letters would fall to the bottom of the screen, didn't do any damage. And he had a solution that ultimately became the antivirus solution for Norton. So I went to my boss, who was the CIO at the time, and said, Bill, we've got to go talk about this. He said, well, I don't have time now. I'm working on my presentation to the board, and it's tomorrow morning. So catch me in front of the boardroom, brief me so he could brief the board. Got to him about 5 to 10, 10 to 10, because they had a 10 o'clock board meeting. Explained to him what we had, and he said, hey, Katz, that's great. Why don't you take the first 5 minutes and let the board of directors know what you've come up with?
No way. Were you prepared to present to the board of directors?
God, absolutely not. It was insane. What it did do is give me my first two lessons, and that probably carried me through most of my career, the corporate world. And so I walked in, and you have to imagine the boardroom at Morgan Guaranty, which is a huge table. It probably cost more than a house at the time. And remember sitting around the boardroom, and the financial, the CEOs of some of the major financial firms around the country. And so I began with, how many of you have heard anything about these computer viruses? And a bunch of hands went up, and that was great. I said, and here's lesson one: tell a story that the audience can relate to. I said, picture yourself down at the trading room downstairs. And 5s become 8s, and 6s become 9s, and 4s become 0s, and yada, yada, yada. I said, what would that do to our trading position? And they looked at me and said, could that really happen? And I said, absolutely. Well, it was good to stress the truth, because the viruses were pretty innocuous at the time. But it got their attention, because they realized that our trading position would have been totally off. So the first is, tell a story your audience can relate to. And the second was, they said, well, can you prevent it? And I said, I can't really prevent it, but I can reduce the risk of dealing with it and make some of the viruses go away. So this is one, tell a story, and two, tell the truth. They said, what do you need to make the virus to, reduce the likelihood of the viruses? I said, at that time, $400,000, which is a fairly big amount of money at the time. And they said, great, you've got to go do it and let us know how it's going. And those two concepts were foundational to the career I built at Morgan and then at Citi, is tell a meaningful story that your audience can relate to, and be absolutely transparent. I could not make the risk go to zero. I could reduce it, so that if you can, develop credibility, tell a clear story, and be absolutely honest. And that worked very well at Morgan Guaranty, then became JP Morgan. We put in a PC security program. We put in a mid-range security program. And that was going pretty well. And in 1994, 95, rumor on Wall Street was that Citicorp had been hacked, but it was kept pretty quiet. And a recruiter called and asked me if I'd be interested in meeting with Citi to talk about their data security program. And my interest was primarily one of, if it happened there, it happened here, how could I prevent it at Morgan? So we went in for the interview. It was probably a 6-month interview process, so went back and forth, and started with them, and started with them, I guess, must have been June, July of 1995. And it turned out it was the international funds transfer system was hacked by a couple of kids in St. Petersburg, Russia. And this was really pre-internet. They were looking for free dial-in service, and they reached our development data center, or the city's development data center. And at the time, they were doing absolutely everything wrong. You had production data in the development data center. You had production password files. Really easy to get into. Once they realized where they were, they then hacked into the DFAX, International Funds Transfer system, and started moving money. They moved about $10 million across the network. 400,000 moved out before it was caught, and once it was caught, it became a board action. The board directed the CEO, John Reed at the time, to bring in a cybersecurity or information security risk executive. So they initiated a search under the guidance of the board, the audit committee, and the CEO. They reached out to me, I guess it was February, March of '95. I finished the interview process and started there in July of '95. And I was told when I got there that we were going to announce the hack roughly a month after I got there. And I really had two challenges. One was to build the best information security group anywhere in the world so that it wouldn't happen again. And two, when the hack was announced, to go out and meet with the top 20 international banking clients and prevent the hemorrhage of these clients leaving the city and going someplace else. Great challenge, and initially I had an absolutely unlimited budget to just build whatever I had to build. It was created from whole cloth. A lot of what you look at today didn't exist, and we just made it happen in '95. It was, this whole idea of business information security officers was part of it. The idea of getting business executives directly involved in routinely speaking about data security and information security risk. Getting security executives to understand that data security was a business risk, and we put in a risk acceptance process, which required the security executives to sign off on any risk that, or whether they weren't conforming to policies or standards. And they then went and had that happen and brought in a really good chief admin officer who helped keep the wheels on the bus while I went around the world and spoke with roughly 20, 25 of our top international banking clients, as well as city corp leadership around the globe as to why information security was important, what it was all about, business impact was all about. And that turned out to be pretty successful because I must have done something right, because we didn't lose a single customer. Did get buy-in and interest from the top executives of Citi, both internationally and domestically. But really talking about the foundation of information security, knowing who you're talking to, controlling, once you know who they are, controlling how limiting what they could do, talking about data confidentiality and privacy, data integrity, what happens when you have a problem and you go down. So we first spoke, whether it was to the a banking customer, to the international leadership, talking about the business impact of any of these issues, and getting people to say, well, gee, are you concerned about who you're talking to? And when you got a yes to that, once you know who they are, do you want to be able to control what they can do? Yes to that. And so we spoke about the what and why primarily, and the so what. And then here's how we're going to do it. And we're talking to the international banking customers that became set back. They understood why it was important. I said, here's how we are answering these questions of who they are, how do we control them, how do we deal with privacy. Here's how Citi is answering it today. Here's how we're answering in 6 months. And you probably want to go and check how you're doing this within your own company, and also ask your other banks how they're doing it, and which they did. And much to Citi's I guess satisfaction, I'd given all these people my office number, my home number, my pager number, and a whole bunch of other things, and said, look, go out and ask these other banks how they are answering these questions. And they came back to me after a month, 6 weeks, and said, these other banks told us they can't talk about it because it's security. And I said, hey, that's absolutely bogus. You're their customer. You need to know. So transparency became incredibly important, and we were hoping not to lose more than 50% of the customers. We didn't lose any, again, because we told a meaningful story, meaningful so what, and meaningful how we're dealing with it. And that transparency and understanding, allowed us to keep all our clients, because the other banks really didn't want to talk about it. So that worked out very well. And from there on, the city gave me free rein to put together a global department. I met with business leaders around the globe and domestically. I probably put out a couple of 100,000 miles the first year of my city, and continued to do 100, 150 to 250,000 miles every year, going around and meeting with business executives and customers around the globe, talking about what information security is, what it was, why it was important, how it was done, what the business impact of security was. We put together a pretty effective security awareness program where we had the CEO on videotape talking about how Citi really had two products, money and trust. And if you can't sell the trust, you won't be able to sell the money. And that sort of resonated with a whole lot of folks. The whole concept of business information security officers were born there. Putting in end-to-end encryption was sort of born there. Having IDs and passwords on at all levels was born there, and it didn't matter whether you were on a PC or on a mid-range processor or on a mainframe. And continuing to talk about the levels of risk that we were dealing with, but it all came down to business risk, why it was important to a business and why it wasn't important to a business. We also put together, and I think I'm still on a patent, called Citi ISEM, which is City Information Security assessment system. We would go out and talk to business leaders about, ask them 20 questions about how they felt they should secure their data and what was important and what wasn't important. And we'd come up with a score of 1 to 5, and then go out and look at the implementation of security around their applications, and where there's a difference, discuss it with them. And then we had these ongoing discussions of what was, what we were providing, what we weren't providing, what we needed to provide. But we made sure that there was always direct business leadership involvement in everything we did. Also reported into a Windows on Risk committee that Citi had that was monitoring the overall program, and that made life a heck of a lot easier because we had the Citi's top leadership as part of this Windows on Risk program, as well as the general auditor. And we meet with them every 4 months, and it was a totally tough meeting, but we had their support in implementing a program.
Yeah, that's an unbelievable, absolutely incredible story. And I believe that a lot of the fundamentals that you covered, through the past couple of minutes apply today. Yeah, absolutely. So what's your take? I mean, things really advanced, right? So now we have thousands of vendors, right? There are, the growing population of IT professionals that are focused on security. It looks like the industry itself is maturing, or trying to get more mature, especially for the larger enterprises and financials. What's your take on that in this space? Do you see, the kind of, first of all, the number of vendors consolidating over time? Are enterprise looking to do more with less, or what kind of the trends that you're seeing? In kind of the current environment for cybersecurity, especially with large enterprise?
First of all, on the vendor side, there are probably a new vendor appears roughly every 15 minutes. I mean, not literally, but everyone's coming up with the newest and best silver bullet that will cure everything, including world hunger and world peace. And I would make it a point of meeting with a new vendor at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. And it was generally about 7 o'clock in the morning, which didn't make the new vendor particularly happy. But it worked out well because it was a way of staying in touch with what was being developed. And I think still, folks are still doing that today. But when the new vendor came in, and I had admin, in fact, three of them in the city, one after the other. They would also. I generally tried to get to the office by 6:30 every morning, and a vendor would come in and sit down, and between 7:05 and 7:10, my admin would come in and tell me I had an important phone call. If the message was coming across very loudly and clearly, I would ask my admin to see if they could hold the call for a half hour. And if the message wasn't clear and concise and crisp and wasn't addressing a business issue, I would explain to the vendor that we had to reschedule because I had to take this phone call, and invariably there would not be a follow-on meeting. And the first question I would ask these guys is, okay, what is the business problem you're solving? What's the business rationale? What is the so what of your product? And the word got around that Cash is going to continue to ask you the so what. And the so what became extremely meaningful.
I love that. I love that because I think a lot of vendors don't, they jump into the nuts and bolts of the technology and they don't ask the so what question right up front. And it's not like kind of the first bullet, like the first thing that they in terms of their messaging, they don't harp on that.
No, they're trying to tell you why they're better than sliced bread. If there isn't a meaningful so what, there isn't a meaningful need for the product. I can't go ahead and be, an active advocate or marginal advocate for the product you're trying to, bring to me, unless there's a significant business so what. And I would do the same thing for the people who work for me. They would come in with whether it's a metric or whether it was an issue, and the question I would ask them is almost the same question I would ask the vendors. Okay, you're telling me this, so what? And they would start to explain it again. And I said, okay, so what? Until we got to the nugget of so what. So the vendors hated me, and so did a lot of folks on my team. But if we couldn't get to a clear nugget of so what, why was it important, there was no need to talk about it. And it's the same thing for any metric we look at today. Someone comes in and says, we 82,000 pings this month. Okay, so what? We had 82,000 pings. Okay, so what?
Steve, I'm sure you were super popular among the vendors back in the day, and very much popular within your staff as well.
It's an interesting story, which is part of the so what. The data security officers of the New York banks back in the mid 80s would get together every 2 to 3 months for just coffee, donuts, and a discussion of what was going on. And there was one vendor who I'm not sure they're still in business, but I'll leave the name out. And they came in and I started talking to them about my security requirements. They would tell me they were talking to the other banks in New York and no one thought this was important. So the next time all of us got together, I dialed the number of the vendor. I got the CEO on the phone. I said, hey, Dave, you know that the security issues we're talking about? I said, I think we may need to rethink that. He said, I'm glad you're coming to that conclusion. I said, yeah, I've got the other 12, 13 data security officers from other banks in New York. And interesting enough, we're all having the same problem. And all you heard was, oh, crap. So we realized that there was, while the banks were highly competitive in terms of customer acquisition and customer retention, we were not at all competitive when it came down to information security risk. And I think it's the same thing that we have going forward today. In fact, it was one of the reasons why we were able to get the FSI stack started as quickly as we did, is that the New York banks were really used to working together. And there was a clear understanding of, as an industry, as a business sector, we really had to stand together, because if one of us got hurt, all of us were ultimately going to get hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can also see tremendous collaboration from the adversary side, right? They do collaborate, they do have their own forums and so on. And this needs to be encouraged, not just in financials, but throughout the different sectors. And I think there's like this FSI sec for the various different industries, like retail, manufacturing, and so on, right? And which.
Yeah, I'm also an advisor to the board of directors of the Health ISAC. And we're doing the same thing in the health sector. I was fortunate enough to be the interim CISO at a major health provider and payer out on the West Coast. And when I walked in there, I wasn't quite sure what I would find. And it's highly similar. First of all, it's, follow the data. The financial services, we always talk about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When I got over to the health sector side, things sort of flipped around a little bit, and it was availability, integrity, and confidentiality. But it still came down to the data and what it took to protect the data and why it was important. And when the physicians would push back in terms of patient safety, and if we do what you want, you're going to cause us to, patients are going to die. And I turned around and said, yep, that's not what we want. But we want to make sure that the data is available to you when you need it. And when we had concurrence, again, business risk, we're going to help keep your patients alive by making sure the information that you need to treat your patients are constantly available. And then the integrity of information, became secondary to availability, and confidentiality came in third. But it came down to the same general message of we need to ensure that we can maintain the trust of, in this case, patient data, and make sure it's available when you needed it.
Yeah, that's incredible that, across industries, priorities may change, but the fundamentals are basically very, very similar. So we're out of time, but I want to jump into the topic of maybe like your experience. There's a lot of new generation now that wants to come in and contribute to the cybersecurity space. And I always ask that question, what do you recommend for someone who's just getting into an industry, maybe without prior experience, or is doing something else within the industry, maybe in IT, and wants to jump with 2 feet into the space? What would you recommend, from your perspective?
I do a lot of mentoring and coaching, and both for current CISOs, security organizations, and CISO wannabes. And the first question I ask the CISO wannabe is, why in creation do you want to do this? Because the vast majority of them today, even today, are coming from technology. And if you're a really solid technologist, if you're a technological expert, you have the best security blanket in the world. You could walk out of company A and go on Friday and go to company B the following week and with a 20% increase. Solid skills, solid experience. So you are an expert. And I hear, well, I'm going to make more money. That's great. So what? Do you think you're going to enjoy what you're doing? Well, I think it's the same as what I'm doing now. No, it's not. You need to develop a lot of soft skills that you may or may not have ever used. If you're going to take on the CISO role, emphasize the C, and that you're going to be a C-level executive. You're going to run a business within a business. You're going to have to negotiate product. You're going to have to be the chief marketing officer for information security and information risk. You're going to be the chief evangelist. You're going to spend 30, 40, 50% of your time evangelizing your program, working with the board, working with business leadership. And you're going to go from being an expert to being proficient to being knowledgeable. And you may never climb that mountain again. So make sure it's something you really want to do and that you have a passion for. You will no longer have that security blanket of being the expert. So think about it a little bit before before you jump off the top of the mountain.
It's almost like Steve is beware for what you wish for.
Absolutely right.
That's amazing. So, and thank you very much for giving back. Again, you're very involved, and there's been an absolutely amazing discussion. And again, I think I'll definitely go ahead and watch this again because there's a lot of content here that's very valuable. Where can people find you, and what's the best way to do that? And if somebody wants to maybe an advice, mentorship, or anything like that, what's kind of the best way?
The easiest, two easy way. One is LinkedIn, because I'm there. And the other is just my personal email, which is stevek01@mac.com. Happy to help out, and try me once for free, and then you can figure out if you want to pay me.
That sounds like a fair deal. I always tell people this is America, right? There's no harm done by
Sure.
making money. Perfect. So I hope things are going to get better in terms of the COVID-19, and we'll get to do this in person, maybe in New York, in one of the upcoming event, maybe towards the tail end of the year. Steve, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for joining the group, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you in person sometime in the near future.
Me too, David. Thank you for the time.
Thank you all for joining. Much appreciated.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.